Movie theater shooter.
Theater shootings. Children's Hospital in Aurora has 6 victims. The youngest victim is 6 years old.
One of the things to sort of remember about this is that so much of it was about, first of all, it was a terrible tragedy, but like any good news organization, you don't like covering these things, but you want to be prepared and ready to cover these things if you have to, because it's moments like these when your city, your state, your community, in this case, this was an international story, when they need you, and they need you for verifiable information. So really leading up to this, we had done a lot of training. I had led a lot of training on best practices for using Twitter, best ways to find information, to seek sources on social media. And so we were doing that really months ahead of time. Of course, you know, we had other breaking news incidents where we could sort of apply what we had learned from that, and we evolved. If we found something or a technique that helped us, we did. So, you know, we found that for finding family members and stuff, that using Facebook was really effective, and messaging people on Facebook is really effective. Now, these days, it's just something you commonly do when you have to reach victims or friends or family. But we talked about, for instance, the right way to reach out to family members of victims. There really is a way that you need to do that in order to respect their space and privacy. We talked about how valuable Twitter could be used for breaking news. And it was really the first time I think, what was so different about it was that it really was just this sort of stream of information, both verified and unverified, and so much of what we had to teach each other was how to distinguish between verified information and unverified information. We did a lot of training and teaching to lead up to this, and you know, it paid off. The very first person to see the first news of it was a digital producer who saw a tweet about it at 12:30 in the morning, and immediately picked up the phone and called editors to start bringing reporters in, because we knew it was really bad. But without that training and teaching, we would have potentially been hours behind everyone else. We would have missed the story. So it's a mixture of people who reporters, so journalists, writers. And then photographers, so people taking still photographs, and then people doing video. And we had all three. And then we also had graphic and infographic artists, so people who could, tell stories like a map of the theater or something, and could create a map of the theater. And then we had interactive or digital journalists who were able to take all that information and publish it online, take that information, publish it on social media. So one of our interactive journalists quickly made an interactive timeline, sort of a minute by minute, what happened, like when did the first call come, when were the first shots fired, like, and really, like, when we talk about the Polar Surprise, what we focused on was really the first 4 days, because that was incident to the theater, to the recovery, to sort of the vigil and the mourning within the community, which of course didn't just happen over one day, all the way to the suspects, now convicted murderers' first court appearance. So it was really that first 4 days, was what we focused on, and that was really hardest. I explained to you before that I actually wasn't in the newsroom. I was going to a wedding of my friend, and I was on an overnight flight, got off the flight, turned on my phone and saw all the messages, immediately started working from my parents' kitchen in New Jersey, 2 time zones and 2,000 miles away. But again, at this point, like, they had all had the training and teaching, and they, there were reporters both in the newsroom and then people out on scene. There were so many places. There was, of course, the suspect's apartment, there was the theater, there was the school, there were police stations and the courts, so we had people just everywhere. But we also had, this is one of those cases where when you have 100, 120, 200 people in your newsroom, like all 200 of those people are covering this story. They're even sports writers, people who cover soccer and football and basketball, like, are writing about this story. So it's one of those rare cases where when you have a story that's big like this, everyone's contributing and you really feel and work like a team. This was in 2012, so Facebook Live didn't exist, YouTube Live didn't exist. At that point, we were just starting to experiment with live video, and the technology at that time to do that it existed, but it was really in its infancy. We managed to, during the first court appearance, do a live feed of the first court appearance by doing some tricky things to get plug into a television. One of our television partners, we were able to get their feed and broadcast it and stream it on our site. By the time the trial came around, actually, we broadcast the trial live on our website. I think it lasted for 2 or 3 months total. I'm forgetting the exact time, but we were doing that. And then, of course, like, during it, we weren't able to always do live video, but we would record video really quickly and post it really quickly on our site. We also used a live blog, so I was in charge of, along with a couple other people, of curating a blog of updates, photos, tweets, verified information from our reporters and other news sources, including some of our media partners in the city. And we had to be very careful about what we pulled. We sent out numerous, messages to our reporters: be careful about what you look, verify, call people, call officials, verify these things. Twitter very much was a sort of a tip line for us. Like, we'd see something and we'd try to verify it ourselves before we passed along the information. I think we were all really proud of the fact that we really kept mistakes to a minimum. We did not pass along bad information. I think one of the worst examples was when the police mistakenly said that 14 people had died instead of 12 people. Once they made their correction, we corrected quickly. But anytime you're in a situation like this, you have to be extra careful, because it's just so easy when you're a media outlet like ourselves to amplify false information, and you have got to resist the urge to say, well, everyone's saying this, so it must be true. No, you have to call, you have to check, talk to officials, and trust your reporters on the ground. There's nothing that replaces, frankly, having journalists on the ground in a situation. It can be chaotic and crazy, but you have firsthand witnesses who are trained to do this stuff. It's much easier to be able to pass along verified information when you're on the ground. But it's also important, of course, to have people in the newsroom who are out of that and can sort of take all the information coming from many different directions, many different people, and try to synthesize it and put it all together. One of the easiest, and my memory honestly from this is difficult, but one of the easiest things you can do in a situation like this is wrongly identify a victim. We saw this during the Boston Marathon bombing. The wrong victim perpetrator was identified. We certainly saw this a few months later during the Sandy Hook shooting, just bad information being passed along. I think it was a couple of things. One, we just were hyper vigilant to the fact that we were going to rely on our journalists on the ground and trust what they were telling us. So if they were at a press conference with police or authorities or the governor, politicians who were giving updates, like we trusted that. You know, President Obama came during for a hospital visit, I think on that Sunday, and you know, we just relied heavily on our reporters. We relied on other trusted news organizations we're a part of, like the Associated Press, who have their own extremely rigorous fact-checking. It often means you are slower than other people, and that's always the tug of war, like between being first and being right, but you really want to be right. Usually, and I'm sure this was the case here, in a case like this, you often will get the perpetrator named before officials release it. In that case, like, again, we're not going to, like, let's, and again, I'm fairly certain this happened, but they named the perpetrator, James Holmes, and then we see that, and it's our job to try and use our sources that we've cultivated through many, many months and years, our sources to try and confirm that. Many times they will only tell us stuff off the record, so not for attribution, or on background, you know, so you'll see phrases like a senior law enforcement official confirm that the suspect is da-da-da-da-da-da. And so that's often how these things, and eventually the police officially release it. But it's really just trusting trained reporters and journalists. And you just have to, I think now increasingly you have to be, and we certainly were then, you have to also recognize that there are a lot of people who don't like the media and will try to trick them to make them look bad. Because it's easy to hate what we do, honestly. I mean, especially when you're reporting on grief and tragedy like this, it's really easy. But you just have to be extra vigilant. As I mentioned before, the shooting happened at 12:39 a.m. We did not publish the first story until 2:42 in the morning. So that's roughly a 2-hour gap between the two. You know, photos and things like that, but taking a lot of information from the scene. Also being clear that we also wanted to be clear with our audience that you know, information can change, and that it was. I am honestly proud to say that we did not make serious mistakes. Certainly things like typos and things like that, but to my knowledge, like, we didn't make any serious factual errors, and out of just sloppy reporting. Now, again, details could have changed later, you know, victims and other things like that, but we were really careful to rely on official sources before moving forward with anything. In situations like this, people sort of instinctively know, our readers distinctively know, and it's honestly instinctively know to come to us for that news. We were an international destination for people. Millions and millions of people came to read our news. And I attribute that to the fact that we were providing fast, reliable information as best as we possibly could. And you know, we of course shared our stuff on social media, on Facebook and Twitter were really the big things. Instagram wasn't really a thing at that time. Facebook and Twitter were our main sources. We posted stuff on Google Plus then too, but Facebook and Twitter were our main sources. And we had a lot of people who, a lot of journalists and other people who came to rely on us to pass along information, because it was real time. They could see when we had fresh information. If we had fresh information, we almost always tweeted it. You know, an update to a story. I was saying before that we updated our main story 36 times in a roughly 24-hour period before the day was out and we started a new story. We didn't publish the first story. This goes back to your verification question. We didn't publish the first story until about an hour and a half after the first shots were fired. That's an example of us being really careful to ensure that what we were publishing was accurate and correct. In fact, the first thing we actually did was posted a photo gallery from the scene before we even had text written. But we wanted to make sure that what we published first was right, and so that's why the delay. They were both effective in different ways. I think Facebook was certainly the place for most people to get updates about the story. It's where they were comfortable because it was not only where they could get official information, but also sort of share in the grief and share their thoughts and feelings with their community while also getting information from us. So we published stories, photos, video many times. I don't think Facebook could handle video at that point, at least I don't think so. And Twitter was different because it was the place where we could share updates very, very quickly and get them out quickly and share them with people without fear that it would become buried or something like that. It was the best place for real-time information. It was the best place for us to see what other stories people were tweeting, writing about. On a story like this, there's so many people covering it, from local outlets to national outlets, that you really have to be very vigilant about what's being said so that you're fully aware of what's being published, so you can check out rumors, check out potential stories. But they were both valuable. Twitter, very much a place where journalists, community members, activists, really influential people were coalescing. And Facebook, really much more for everyone, really everyone. It was the place where we reached the most people, without a doubt. But both were important for different reasons. I'd say up until this point, traditionally, we want to bring people back to our website because we could, monetize the audience through advertising, which, again sounds grim in the context of this, but, it takes an incredible amount of resources to cover this. It's incredibly challenging to do so. And so, but this was a case where normally we'd be sort of focused on trying to bring people back to our website. A lot of times, if we just had a photo, like we just tweet out the photo. If we had reporters, I was watching a feed and list of our reporters, and so if they had a photo or a video or a quote from a press conference they shared, I'd often retweet them, share those quotes and updates on our Facebook page. So it wasn't always about just getting people back to our website. It was really much more about sharing information as soon as we had it. And then when we had more complete stories written, that's when we'd share a link and bring people back, pull out interesting quotes. But it really was a balance, and again, I think for the best of the community, that's what made sense. I had to use my own judgment. Most of what I shared was our own reporters and our own verified media partners and our own stories. So you'd wait for a story to be published and then you'd tweet it out or you'd share it on Facebook. So, and by that point it had gone through reporting, editing, scrutiny, people had asked questions. So I felt much more comfortable sharing that stuff, even though, sometimes you'd be, again, late to something compared to another media outlet. You knew that it had passed fact-checking and stuff. And honestly, like during chaotic situations like this, you do the best fact-checking you can, and sometimes details change. And that's not through nobody's fault to their own, but it's just a chaotic scene. And so official numbers may be changed, other small details change, but you always source that. You always say, you don't say 12 people died and 71 people were shot. Well, according to who? I'm not just, I can't say I made this up, according to law enforcement officials or the governor's office, whoever. You always want to attribute that information because you want to give as much information to the reader as possible so that the reader can understand where information's coming from. I was responsible for what we posted, but behind me, editors and reporters were responsible for ensuring that the information that got to me, of course, was accurate and verified. So I was, in a lot of ways, the last line in the process. So, reporter reports, writes a story, takes photographs, shoots video, editor edits it, another editor edits it. Maybe if it's really important, 3 or 4 more editors edit it. Then it goes from there to the digital team. It's published online, and then it goes from there to me. And I'm reading through stories and trying to find relevant facts and details that fit really nicely in 140 characters or can be shared really easily. So my job was, in a lot of ways, sharing and amplifying quickly with a large audience. But prior to all that, there was a lot of important work to ensure that what was being shared was accurate and verified. We did post pictures with blood. We didn't post bodies, and honestly, we would not have, even if we didn't get access to the theater anyway. But we did not get access to the theater, so we wouldn't have been able to get that anyway. But even then, if you have a situation like that, you've got to be extremely discerning on what your goal here. Why would you publish something like that? In the case of the one photo of blood that we published was, or at least the one that stands out in my mind, was our photographers. One of our photographers went up in a helicopter and flew over the theater. And there's a really famous picture that Helen Richardson, one of our photographers, took of this trail of blood from the back of the theater to the car, which was where the shooter's car was parked. And it was this really haunting photograph, but it's sort of like, there wasn't a body or anything, but it was just, there were evidence markers everywhere. And it really showed, I think, it really depicted the horror in a really, not in a gruesome way, but it was just like, this is serious stuff. And we never published pictures from inside the theater. Again, we never had access. It was a secured crime scene. We couldn't get access. For sure, police had those pictures, and I'm sure but they were never released. And again, I think there's certain, sort of guidelines that it would have taken a lot for us to publish something like that, and we would have likely faced very serious backlash. But in terms of like ethics, like that was a big one. I mean, there's even, you have to think about like depicting grief. Like for a lot of this, you're depicting people, in the absolute worst moment of their lives, the worst moment of their lives. Their friends are dead, their family is dead. So, I mean, the very first photo that we published on the front page the next day was a picture of a father hugging his family members after he had just found out his son was among the dead. And the reaction, I've talked to him actually a few times since then, but it is a picture of this man in the absolute worst moment of his life. He's about ready to embrace, and he's just heard that his son has died. And that's not a gruesome photo, but it's an incredibly powerful photo to like depict the magnitude of grief that somebody is going through. And again, we publish these things because we want people to see the consequences of this stuff. You can get into all kinds of discussions about gun control and mental health and other things, but it's our job to reflect the truth as close as we possibly can. And part of that truth is the fact that there was, of course, intense grieving and tragedy here, and that's what we focused on. I'll read the citation from the Pulitzer Board for its comprehensive coverage of the mass shooting at a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado that killed 12, injured 58, using journalistic tools from Twitter and Facebook to video and written reports, both to capture a breaking story and provide context. I think it's really about how you respond. It's really about how you respond to a situation like that. In this case, it was providing the full context of a story, both as it evolves, but then being able to also, like, it's not just about covering the news as it comes up, but it's also being able to step back and provide much larger context stories. Again, about victims, about the shooter. These are things that take time to do. And then also stuff about, police response, for instance. So there's so many facets to it. It's not just like a shooting happened, a tragedy happened, people died, there were injuries. It's also all these other pieces to it as well. We took a very hard look in the days and weeks and months ahead at the police response. What could have been done differently? Did they do the best they could? I mean, there were police officers taking victims, shot victims, like in the back of their patrol car because they just didn't have enough ambulances available. There were too many people who were hurt and injured. And all of that stuff just goes into providing this. So the board that chooses these things, it's a very, it's a process that many people take part in. I wasn't a part of it, but I like to think that the comprehensiveness of our reporting in so many different ways, this wasn't just in words, all these pieces come together to tell a story of a really terrible day. Photography, reporting, videography, graphics, everything in different formats, both providing immediacy to our readers and being able to step back and ask much more serious questions about why this happened and what we needed to do next to heal as a community.